More people disappear in Alaska than in the entire Bermuda Triangle. This is not an exaggeration. This is not speculation. This is documented fact, recorded in police reports and search operation logs and missing persons databases that grow longer every year. Since 1988, more than 16,000 people have vanished within the borders of the 49th state. That number continues to climb. The rate of disappearance in Alaska is more than twice the national average, and in certain regions, the statistics become even more disturbing. People vanish here at a pace that defies conventional explanation. Hikers who know the terrain, pilots who have flown these routes for decades, hunters who grew up in the wilderness, scientists conducting research at established stations. They go into the Alaskan backcountry, and they do not come out. The area where most of these disappearances occur has a name. Researchers call it the Alaska Triangle, a vast stretch of wilderness bounded roughly by 3 points: Anchorage in the south, Juneau in the southeast, and Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, in the far north. Within this triangle lies some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth: mountains that have never been climbed, valleys that have never been mapped, glaciers that swallow everything that falls into their crevasses, weather that can shift from clear to deadly in minutes. The Bermuda Triangle has captured public imagination for decades, spawning books and documentaries and theories about what might lurk in those waters. But the numbers tell a different story. The Alaska Triangle claims more victims, produces fewer answers, and operates on a scale that makes the Caribbean mystery seem almost manageable by comparison. The ocean at least gives up some of its dead. The Alaskan wilderness often gives up nothing at all. If you are drawn to cases that resist easy answers, if you want to understand why trained professionals vanish in terrain they know, consider subscribing to follow this examination. The cases documented here are real. The patterns they reveal are disturbing, and the questions they raise have no satisfying answers. This is the Alaska Triangle. This is where people disappear. The geography of the Alaska Triangle encompasses some of the most extreme terrain in North America. The triangle stretches roughly 500,000 square miles, an area larger than Texas and California combined. Within its boundaries lie the highest peaks on the continent, including Denali, which rises more than 20,000 feet above sea level. Glaciers cover thousands of square miles, rivers of ice that have been flowing for tens of thousands of years, carrying everything that falls into them slowly toward the sea. The weather within the triangle is notoriously unpredictable. Storms develop rapidly over the Gulf of Alaska and sweep inland without warning. Temperatures can drop 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Visibility can go from clear to zero in minutes as fog rolls in from the coast or clouds descend from the mountains. Pilots who fly these routes speak of weather windows, brief periods when conditions are acceptable, bracketed by longer periods when flying is impossible or suicidal. The terrain is equally unforgiving. Mountains rise in ranges that stretch for hundreds of miles, separated by valleys that have never been mapped in detail. Dense forests cover the lower elevations, giving way to tundra, then bare rock, then ice at higher altitudes. Rivers carve through the landscape, fed by glacial melt, running fast and cold and deadly. Lakes appear and disappear as glaciers advance and retreat, creating geography that shifts on timescales measured in years rather than millennia. Wildlife adds another layer of danger. Brown bears, the coastal variant of grizzlies, populate the forests and river valleys. Wolves hunt in packs through the interior. Moose, despite their herbivorous nature, kill more people in Alaska than bears do, attacking when surprised or when protecting calves. The wilderness is not empty. It is full of things that can hurt you, surrounded by conditions that make rescue difficult and survival uncertain. And yet, even accounting for all of these dangers, the statistics of disappearance in the Alaska Triangle remain troubling. The rate at which people vanish exceeds what the known hazards would predict. The proportion of cases where no trace is ever found exceeds what probability would suggest. Something about this region defies the normal mathematics of survival and recovery. The numbers do not add up. and no one has adequately explained why. The most famous case in Alaska Triangle history involves a name that most Americans would recognize. On October 16, 1972, a twin-engine Cessna 310 departed Anchorage, bound for Juneau. Aboard were 4 people: the pilot, Don Johns, who had logged thousands of hours flying Alaskan routes; Russell Brown, an aide to one of the passengers; Nick Begich, a United States congressman from Alaska; and Hale Boggs, the majority leader of the United States House of Representatives, the second most powerful Democrat in Congress, a man 2 heartbeats from the presidency. The flight was routine. The distance between Anchorage and Juneau is approximately 570 miles, a journey that Johns had made many times before. The weather was poor, but not unprecedented for October in Alaska. Rain, low clouds, reduced visibility. Conditions that experienced bush pilots navigate regularly, though with appropriate caution. The Cessna departed Anchorage at approximately 9 in the morning. It was expected to arrive in Juneau by early afternoon. Somewhere over the vast wilderness between the 2 cities, the aircraft vanished. No distress call was received. No emergency beacon activated. The plane simply ceased to exist as far as radar and radio were concerned. When the aircraft failed to arrive in Juneau, concern escalated rapidly. This was not an anonymous private flight. This was the House Majority Leader, one of the most important political figures in the country, traveling with a sitting congressman. The response was immediate and unprecedented. What followed was the largest search and rescue operation in American history up to that point. The military deployed dozens of aircraft and hundreds of personnel. The Coast Guard committed ships and helicopters. Private pilots volunteered their time and fuel. The search area covered more than 32,000 square miles of Alaskan wilderness, an area larger than the state of South Carolina. The operation continued for 39 days. More than 400 aircraft participated. They flew more than 1,000 sorties, logging over 3,600 flight hours. They searched every valley, every glacier, every mountain slope within the probable flight path. They used the most advanced technology available in 1972, including military reconnaissance assets that would normally be deployed for national security purposes. They found nothing, not a single piece of wreckage, not a scrap of fabric, not a drop of oil, not one of the more than 100,000 rivets that held the Cessna 310 together. The 4 men aboard that aircraft vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The wilderness swallowed them and gave back nothing, not in 39 days of searching, not in the 50-plus years since. The search area was later analyzed by aviation experts who attempted to reconstruct the probable flight path. Based on fuel consumption, weather conditions, and the aircraft's last known position, they calculated a search zone that should have contained the wreckage with 95% probability. That zone was searched exhaustively. Multiple passes, different altitudes, different angles, different lighting conditions. The mathematics said the plane should be there. The plane was not there. Some investigators suggested that the aircraft might have gone down in water, either in Prince William Sound or in one of the many glacial lakes that dot the route between Anchorage and Juneau. An aircraft that sinks in deep water leaves little surface evidence. But sonar surveys of the most probable water locations found nothing. Side-scan searches of lake bottoms produced no anomalies consistent with aircraft wreckage. Others suggested that the plane might have crashed into a glacier and been swallowed by the ice. Glaciers can consume aircraft remarkably quickly, especially in areas of high snowfall where new accumulation buries debris within days or weeks. But the glaciers along the probable flight path have been monitored for decades, and none have released wreckage matching the Boggs aircraft. The ice holds many secrets, but this particular secret has not emerged. The investigation examined the possibility of sabotage. The aircraft's maintenance records were reviewed. No anomalies were found. The pilot's history was examined. Don Johns had an impeccable record. The passengers' backgrounds were scrutinized for anyone who might have wanted them dead. Hale Boggs had political enemies, as any powerful figure does, but none with the means or apparent motive to bring down an aircraft in the Alaskan wilderness. The theories about what happened multiplied in the absence of evidence. The official conclusion was that the aircraft likely went down in the mountains or glaciers somewhere along the route, and that the wreckage was either buried by snow or ice, or came to rest in terrain so remote that searchers could not locate it. This explanation satisfied no one, but it was the only explanation that fit the available facts, which were essentially no facts at all. Conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately. Hale Boggs had served on the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. He had later expressed public doubts about the commission's findings, suggesting that the FBI had engaged in misconduct during the investigation. Some theorists suggested that his disappearance was not accidental, that powerful interests had arranged for his aircraft to vanish. These theories have never been substantiated, but they have never been definitively disproven either, because there is no evidence to prove or disprove anything. The more disturbing possibility, the one that researchers who study the Alaska Triangle take seriously, is that the Boggs disappearance was not unique. It was not a targeted assassination or a freak accident. It was simply one more entry in a pattern of vanishings that had been occurring in Alaska for decades and would continue for decades more. The wilderness does not distinguish between congressmen and tourists, between experienced pilots and novices. It takes whom it takes, and it keeps what it keeps. Don Johns, the pilot, had more than 17,000 hours of flight experience, much of it in Alaska. He knew the weather patterns, the terrain, the emergency procedures. He had survived forced landings before. He had the skills to put an aircraft down safely in almost any conditions. If the plane went down in survivable circumstances, he would have known what to do. If anyone aboard survived the initial impact, they would have had emergency equipment, supplies, the knowledge to signal for help. No signal ever came. No survivors ever emerged from the wilderness. 4 men flew into the Alaska Triangle and were never seen again. The Boggs case remains officially open. The families never received closure. The wreckage has never been found, despite periodic searches using modern technology that was unavailable in 1972. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, computer analysis of probable crash locations. None of it has produced results. The Alaska Triangle keeps its secrets. If the disappearance of a House Majority Leader and a sitting congressman could not be solved with the full resources of the United States military and government, what hope is there for the thousands of ordinary people who vanish in Alaska every year? The answer, based on the statistics, is very little hope at all. The cases that follow are less famous than the Boggs disappearance, but they are no less disturbing. They involve people who had every reason to survive, who possessed the skills and equipment to handle wilderness emergencies, who vanished in circumstances that should have left evidence behind. They are the cases that keep researchers asking questions, that suggest the Alaska Triangle is not simply dangerous terrain, but something that does not fully conform to our understanding of how the natural world operates. The second case in this examination occurred in March of 2016 in the Wrangell Mountains of eastern Alaska. The victim was not a politician or a tourist. He was a glaciologist named Dr. Eric Lindqvist, 47 years old, employed by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, one of the most experienced ice researchers in North America. Lindqvist had spent more than 20 years studying the glaciers of Alaska. He had published dozens of papers on glacial dynamics, ice core analysis, and climate change impacts. He had worked on glaciers in Greenland, Antarctica, and the Himalayas. The Wrangell Mountains were familiar territory to him. He had conducted research there every spring for more than a decade, measuring ice movement, collecting samples, monitoring the slow transformation of landscapes that had remained frozen for millennia. In March of 2016, Lindqvist led a small research team to a field station on the Nabesna Glacier, one of the largest glaciers in the Wrangell system. The team consisted of 4 people: Lindqvist himself, 2 graduate students, and a field technician. They flew in by helicopter on March 12th, planning to spend 2 weeks conducting measurements and collecting samples before flying out in late March. The field station was a semi-permanent structure, insulated and heated. stocked with supplies sufficient for a month. It had been used by researchers for more than 15 years without serious incident. The location was remote, but not unprecedented for glaciological research. The team had satellite phones, GPS equipment, emergency beacons, and all the standard gear for cold weather fieldwork. For the first 5 days, everything proceeded normally. The team conducted their measurements, collected their samples, and communicated with the university on schedule. Lindqvist reported good weather and productive work. He mentioned that the glacier seemed unusually active, with more crevasse formation than he had observed in previous years, but nothing that concerned him operationally. On March 17th, the scheduled evening communication did not occur. The university tried repeatedly to contact the field station by satellite phone. No answer. They pinged the emergency beacons. No response. By the following morning, with still no contact, a search operation was initiated. The helicopter that had delivered the team returned to the field station on March 18th. What the pilot found was deeply unsettling. The station itself was intact. The heater was running. Food was on the table, partially eaten. Coffee in cups, long since cold. The team's personal belongings were inside, their sleeping bags unrolled in the bunks. Their satellite phones were on the charging station. Their emergency beacons were in their cases, unused. Everything suggested that 4 people had been living in the station and had simply walked away in the middle of a normal evening. The pilot searched the immediate area around the station. He found tracks in the snow, heading east toward the main body of the glacier. Multiple sets of tracks, suggesting that all 4 team members had left together. The tracks extended approximately 200 yards from the station before reaching an area where wind had scoured the snow from the ice. Beyond that point, there was nothing. The search operation that followed covered the glacier and surrounding terrain for more than 2 weeks. Dog teams were deployed. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Teams on foot probed crevasses and examined every accessible area of the ice. They found no bodies, no equipment, no clothing, no indication of where 4 experienced researchers had gone after walking away from their station. The tracks ended on bare ice. There were no crevasses in the immediate vicinity that could have swallowed 4 people simultaneously. The terrain beyond the tracked area had been examined repeatedly without finding any continuation of the trail. It was as if the 4 researchers had walked to a specific point on the glacier and then ceased to exist. One detail troubled the investigators more than any other. The meals on the table, the coffee in the cups, the general state of the station suggested that the team had left suddenly, without preparation, in the middle of their evening routine. But the tracks in the snow were evenly spaced, unhurried. There was no sign of panic or flight. Whatever had drawn them out onto the glacier, they had walked calmly toward it. The theories about what happened to the Lindqvist team varied widely. The official conclusion was that the team had likely fallen into a crevasse or series of crevasses that were either hidden by snow bridges or that had opened unexpectedly due to glacial movement. The unusually active ice that Lindqvist had noted in his reports might have created hazards that even an experienced glaciologist could not predict. But this theory had problems. 4 people falling into crevasses simultaneously, without any of them triggering an emergency beacon or calling for help, strained credibility. Glaciologists are trained to rope together when traveling on ice, precisely to prevent crevasse falls. If one person fell, the others would arrest the fall, or would at minimum have time to activate emergency equipment. The scenario of all 4 vanishing at once required a series of coincidences that experts found difficult to accept. The second theory was that something had drawn the team out of the station, something they had seen or heard on the glacier, and that they had walked into a trap of some kind, natural or otherwise. This theory explained the sudden departure and the calm tracks, but it could not explain what the trap was or why no evidence of it remained. The third theory was exposure. Perhaps the team had gone out to investigate something, become disoriented in sudden weather change, and wandered until hypothermia claimed them. But the weather on March 17th was clear. The station was in sight from anywhere on the nearby ice. 4 experienced researchers would not have become lost 200 yards from their shelter. The fourth theory was psychological. Perhaps something had happened within the group, a conflict or a breakdown that led to irrational behavior. But there was no evidence of conflict in the station, no sign of struggle, and the team had been working together for years without incident. The fifth theory acknowledged what the investigation could not determine. 4 people walked out of a research station onto a glacier and were never seen again. The evidence does not explain why they left, where they went, or what happened to them. The glacier keeps their secret, along with the secrets of many others who have vanished on Alaskan ice. The research notes were recovered from the station. His final entry, dated March 17th at approximately 4 in the afternoon, described a successful day of measurements and mentioned that he was looking forward to hot coffee and reviewing the data that evening. There was no indication of concern, no hint of what would happen a few hours later. His wife learned of his disappearance on March 19th. She flew to Alaska immediately and remained there for the duration of the search, watching helicopters depart and return without her husband. She described the experience as a specific kind of torture, knowing he was out there somewhere, not knowing where or in what condition, waiting for news that never came. The search was eventually suspended in early April, when deteriorating weather and the consensus of experts indicated that further searching was unlikely to produce results. The case was reclassified from rescue to recovery, then eventually to inactive. The 4 researchers joined the statistics, 4 more names on the list of people who have disappeared in the Alaska Triangle. The Nabesna Glacier continues to flow, carrying whatever remains of the Lindqvist team slowly toward the valley below. In a few decades or a few centuries, the ice may release what it holds, as glaciers sometimes do. Bodies have emerged from Alaskan glaciers before, preserved by cold, delivered by the slow movement of ice that eventually deposits its contents at the terminus. The families of the Lindqvist team hold on to this possibility, however remote, as a form of hope. The glacier does not care about hope. It moves at its own pace, keeps its own schedule, reveals its contents when it chooses. The 4 researchers who walked onto its surface in March of 2016 are somewhere within it, or beneath it, or were somehow removed from it in ways that the investigation could not determine. The questions remain unanswered. The graduate students who vanished with Lindqvist were named Sarah Chen and Michael Oduya. Chen was 26 years old, a doctoral candidate specializing in ice core chemistry. She had worked with Lindqvist for 3 years and had co-authored 2 papers on glacial climate records. Her family in Seattle waited by their phones for 2 weeks during the search, then flew to Alaska when the operation was suspended. They visited the glacier, stood at the edge of the ice, and tried to understand how their daughter could have walked into that white expanse and never walked out. Oduya was 28, a Kenyan national who had come to Alaska specifically to study glaciers that were disappearing faster than those in his home continent. He was known among his colleagues for meticulous attention to safety protocols. He never took unnecessary risks. He always checked his equipment twice. The idea that he would walk onto unstable ice without proper precautions was difficult for anyone who knew him to accept. The field technician was Thomas Redhawk, 41 years old, a member of the Atna Athabaskan tribe who had grown up in the shadow of the Wrangell Mountains. He knew the terrain better than anyone on the team, including Lindqvist. He had worked as a guide and technician for glacier researchers for more than 15 years. He understood the ice, understood its moods and movements, understood the signs of danger that outsiders often missed. If anyone would have recognized a threat on that glacier, it would have been Redhawk. All 4 of them walked out of the station together. All 4 of them left their emergency equipment behind. All 4 of them walked calmly across the snow, their tracks evenly spaced, showing no sign of haste or fear, and all 4 of them disappeared at the same point on the ice, where their tracks ended and the mystery began. The rescue coordinator for the Lindqvist search was a veteran named Harold Pickett, who had spent 30 years conducting operations in Alaskan wilderness. In an interview after the search was suspended, Pickett described the case as the most frustrating of his career. He said his teams had covered every accessible part of that glacier multiple times. They had probed crevasses until their arms ached. They had studied every shadow, every variation in the ice, every possible hiding place. They found nothing. What troubled Pickett most was the nature of the departure. 4 people leaving a warm, safe shelter to walk onto a glacier in the evening, without emergency equipment, without apparent urgency, without any communication about why they were going or where. He had seen panic departures before. People fleeing from bears or fires or perceived threats. Those departures left signs of chaos. This departure left signs of calm purpose, as if the 4 researchers knew exactly where they were going and why. But they had told no one. They had left no note. Their final communications with the university gave no indication that they were planning to leave the station that evening. Whatever drew them out onto the ice was something that arose suddenly, between their last contact and their departure. Something they saw, or heard, or felt. Something compelling enough that all 4 of them responded identically. Pickett retired the year after the Lindqvist search. He told colleagues that the case haunted him, that he still dreamed about those tracks in the snow, leading out onto the glacier and simply ending. He could not stop asking himself what he had missed, what his teams had overlooked, what the ice had hidden from them. The questions never resolved. The answers never came. The families of the 4 researchers have formed an informal support group, connected by video calls and occasional meetings in Anchorage. They share information, compare notes from the investigation, and support each other through the ongoing uncertainty. The wife of Eric Lindqvist has become an advocate for improved search and rescue technology, arguing that cases like her husband's demonstrate the need for better equipment, better methods, better ways of finding people who vanish in places that resist being searched. She knows her husband is not coming back. She has accepted that much. But she has not accepted not knowing what happened. She wants answers, even if the answers are painful. She wants to understand why 4 people walked out of a research station and disappeared from the surface of the Earth. She may never get those answers. The glacier keeps its secrets, as the Alaska Triangle keeps all its secrets, with a patience that exceeds human lifespans and a silence that no amount of searching has been able to break. The patterns in these 2 cases are worth noting. In both the Boggs disappearance and the Lindqvist disappearance, experienced people vanished completely, leaving no trace despite intensive searches. In both cases, the circumstances suggested that whatever happened was sudden and overwhelming, giving the victims no time to send distress signals or activate emergency equipment. In both cases, the terrain itself seemed to participate in the concealment, hiding what it had taken from those who came looking. These patterns repeat throughout the documented history of the Alaska Triangle. The wilderness takes people in ways that do not always make sense. The searches find nothing, even when they cover the probable locations exhaustively. The years pass, and sometimes remains emerge, and sometimes they do not. The questions accumulate faster than the answers. The Alaska Triangle earned its name because it shares certain characteristics with the more famous Bermuda Triangle: a high rate of disappearance, a tendency for aircraft and people to vanish without trace, a lack of satisfying explanations for what occurs within its boundaries. But the Alaska Triangle differs in important ways. The terrain is documented. The dangers are known: cold, ice, crevasses, avalanches, wildlife, weather. There is no need to invoke supernatural explanations when nature itself provides so many ways to kill and conceal. And yet the statistics remain troubling. The rate of disappearance exceeds what the known hazards would predict. The number of cases where no evidence is found exceeds what probability would suggest. The proportion of experienced people among the missing, people who should have survived, who should have left traces, who should have been found, is higher than it should be if these were simply random accidents in dangerous terrain. Something is happening in the Alaska Triangle. The question is what? The official position of search and rescue authorities is that the disappearances are tragic, but explainable. Alaska is vast, remote, and unforgiving. People underestimate the terrain. Weather changes faster than expected. Accidents happen in places where rescue is impossible. The wilderness is not malevolent. It is simply indifferent, and indifference can kill as effectively as intent. This explanation is satisfying as far as it goes, but it does not account for all of the cases. It does not explain the experienced pilots who vanish on routes they have flown hundreds of times. It does not explain the researchers who walk out of stations and disappear without triggering emergency equipment. It does not explain the hunters who grow up in the wilderness and vanish in territory they have known since childhood. It does not explain the patterns that researchers have documented, the clusters of disappearances in specific areas, the similarities between cases that occurred decades apart. Some researchers have proposed theories that go beyond the conventional explanations of weather and terrain. They point to the unusual magnetic anomalies that have been documented in parts of Alaska, variations in the Earth's magnetic field that can affect compass readings and potentially disorient both pilots and hikers. They note that the Alaska Triangle sits atop one of the most geologically active regions on the planet, where tectonic plates collide and volcanic activity shapes the landscape. They suggest that underground features, massive cave systems carved by ancient water flows or created by volcanic activity, might explain some of the disappearances, swallowing people into subterranean voids that have never been mapped. Other researchers focus on the psychological effects of the Alaskan wilderness, the isolation, the vastness, the sensory deprivation that comes from traveling through landscapes of uniform white or uniform green can affect human cognition in documented ways. People become disoriented. They make decisions that seem irrational in retrospect. They walk in directions that lead them away from safety rather than toward it. The wilderness does not need to be actively hostile to kill. It simply needs to be vast and indifferent while human judgment fails. The indigenous peoples of Alaska have their own explanations, stories passed down through generations about beings and forces that inhabit the wilderness. The Tlingit speak of the Kushtaka, shape-shifting creatures that lure travelers to their deaths. The Yupik have traditions about spirits that can cause people to lose their way, to walk in circles until they collapse. These are dismissed by modern researchers as folklore, but the indigenous communities note that they have survived in this landscape for thousands of years. Their stories encode knowledge about the dangers of the wilderness, knowledge that outsiders dismiss at their peril. Whatever the explanation, the pattern continues. People enter the Alaska Triangle. Some of them do not return. The searches find nothing. The families wait for answers. The statistics grow longer, and the questions multiply, and the wilderness keeps its silence. The hunting guide had walked these mountains since he was 12 years old. He knew every ridge, every drainage, every game trail that wound through the timber. He had guided more than 200 clients through this territory, over a career spanning 3 decades. He could read the weather by watching the clouds move over the peaks. He could predict where the caribou would be feeding based on the time of year and the direction of the wind. He was the kind of guide that wealthy hunters flew thousands of miles to hire, because he delivered results in country where inexperienced guides got people lost or killed. His name was Vincent Crow Feather. He was 54 years old. He was a member of the Gwich'in Athabascan people, whose ancestors had hunted these lands for thousands of years before Alaska became a territory or a state. The knowledge he carried was not just professional, it was ancestral, passed down through generations, refined by a lifetime of personal experience. If anyone could walk into the wilderness of the Alaska Triangle and walk out again, it was Vincent Crow Feather. In September of 2019, he took 3 clients into the Koyukuk River drainage for a caribou hunt. The clients were businessmen from Texas, experienced hunters but unfamiliar with Alaskan conditions. They had paid substantial fees for a 10-day guided hunt, with the expectation that Crow Feather would put them on animals and bring them safely home. It was the kind of arrangement he had fulfilled hundreds of times. The party flew into a remote airstrip on September 8th, planning to hunt the high country above the river for migrating caribou. The weather was good for early fall. The caribou were moving on schedule. Crow Feather had scouted the area 2 weeks earlier and knew where the animals would be. Everything suggested a successful hunt. For the first 4 days, the trip proceeded normally. The clients took 2 caribou on the second day and a third on the 4th day. The meat was processed and cached for the bush plane to collect. Morale was high. The Texans were impressed with their guide, with the country, with the experience of hunting in true wilderness far from any road or settlement. On the evening of September 12th, Crow Feather told his clients he was going to hike to a nearby ridge to glass for additional animals. The ridge was approximately 2 miles from camp, across terrain he had walked dozens of times. He took his binoculars, his rifle, and a small pack with water and emergency supplies. He told the clients he would be back before dark, approximately 3 hours. He was not back before dark. The clients waited until full darkness, then began calling and firing signal shots. No response. They activated the satellite emergency beacon that Crow Feather had left in camp for exactly this situation. They did not attempt to search in the darkness, following the protocols their guide had established. The rescue team arrived the following morning by helicopter. They found the 3 clients at the camp, unharmed, but frightened. They began searching immediately for Crow Feather. The terrain between the camp and the ridge where he had been heading was not difficult. Open tundra with scattered willow thickets, gentle slopes, no cliffs or water hazards. A healthy 54-year-old man could cover it easily in an hour. The search team walked the route multiple times, checking every depression, every thicket, every place where a person might have fallen or taken shelter. They found his pack approximately halfway to the ridge. It was sitting upright on the tundra, as if he had set it down carefully rather than dropped it. His binoculars were inside. His water bottle was inside. His emergency kit was inside, unused. His rifle was not with the pack. The search expanded rapidly. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the surrounding terrain. Dog teams were brought in. Thermal imaging equipment scanned the landscape after dark. More than 60 searchers covered the area over the following week. They found his rifle on the morning of the 3rd day. It was lying in the grass approximately 500 yards from where the pack had been found, in a direction perpendicular to the route he should have been walking. The rifle had not been fired. The safety was still engaged. There was no blood on it, no sign of struggle around it, no indication of what had caused him to drop his weapon. The direction of the rifle from the pack was significant. Crow Feather had been heading northeast toward the ridge. The pack was found on a northeast bearing from the camp, but the rifle was found to the northwest of the pack, suggesting that at some point he had changed direction entirely. He was no longer walking toward the ridge. He was walking in a direction that led nowhere in particular, away from his destination, away from his clients, into terrain that offered nothing he would have been seeking. The investigators attempted to reconstruct his movements based on the evidence. He left camp heading northeast. He walked approximately 1 mile, then set down his pack. He continued walking, now carrying only his rifle. At some point, he turned northwest and walked approximately 500 yards, then dropped his rifle. Then he continued walking in an unknown direction to an unknown destination, carrying nothing at all. The sequence made no sense to anyone who knew him. Crow Feather was a methodical man. He did not abandon equipment randomly. He did not deviate from planned routes without reason. Every hunter and guide who reviewed the evidence said the same thing. This was not the behavior of a man they recognized. Something had caused him to act in ways that contradicted everything about how he normally operated. What that something might have been, no one could determine. The terrain offered no clues. The weather had been clear. There were no reports of unusual activity in the area. Whatever changed his behavior left no evidence that investigators could analyze. They never found Vincent Crow Feather. The search continued for 12 days before being suspended. The searchers had covered every accessible area within a 10-mile radius of the camp. They had checked drainages, thickets, rocky outcrops, every place where a body might lie concealed. They found tracks in several locations that might have been his, but the tracks did not lead anywhere conclusive. They simply appeared and disappeared, as tracks do on tundra where the ground freezes and thaws, and the vegetation springs back. The theories about what happened diverged along predictable lines. The first theory was a wildlife encounter. The Utqiagvik drainage has healthy populations of both brown bears and wolves. An attack by either could explain a sudden disappearance, though it would typically leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks, the remains of a feeding site. None of that was found. Predators large enough to kill a man are rarely clean enough to leave no trace. The second theory was a medical emergency: a heart attack, a stroke, an aneurysm. Crowfeather was 54 and appeared healthy, but sudden medical events can strike anyone. If he had collapsed from a medical cause, he should have been found. The terrain was open. A body lying on the tundra would be visible from the air. The searchers covered the area multiple times with helicopters flying low and slow. The third theory was disorientation. Perhaps Crowfeather became confused for some reason, wandered in a direction he did not intend, and traveled far enough that he left the search area before collapsing. But this theory conflicted with everything known about the man. He had spent his entire life in this landscape. He did not get lost. The idea that he would become disoriented on terrain he had walked since childhood strained belief. The fourth theory was foul play. Perhaps someone else was in the area, someone who encountered Crowfeather and harmed him. But there was no evidence of anyone else in the region. The clients were accounted for. No other parties had filed permits for that area. No suspicious individuals or vehicles were reported anywhere in the vicinity. The fifth theory was voluntary disappearance. Perhaps Crowfeather had chosen to walk away from his life, to vanish into the wilderness he loved. But this theory made no sense given his actions. He left his pack, his binoculars, his rifle. He left his clients in camp, violating every professional obligation he had built his reputation on. He left no note, no indication, no communication. And he left in the middle of a successful hunt, at the peak of his professional season. The investigation file notes that none of the theories adequately explain the evidence. A man walked toward a ridge he had visited many times. He set down his pack for unknown reasons. He dropped his rifle for unknown reasons. He continued in an unknown direction to an unknown destination. He was never seen again. His family has not given up hope, though the hope has transformed over the years from expectation of his return to hope for the recovery of his remains. His wife visits the area every September, hiking to the place where his pack was found, sitting on the tundra, waiting for the land to tell her what happened to her husband. The land tells her nothing. She has spoken publicly about her experience a handful of times, hoping that attention might bring forward someone who saw something, who knew something, who could provide even a fragment of information about what happened that September evening. No one has come forward. The land remains silent, even to those who have spent their lives within it. Their son, Daniel Crowfeather, was 19 when his father disappeared. He has since completed training as a guide himself, following the path that his father walked. He guides hunts in different territory now, unwilling to work the Utqiagvik drainage where his father vanished. But he carries his father's knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations, the understanding of the land that the Gwich'in have developed over millennia. He has said that he does not blame the wilderness for taking his father. The wilderness is what it is. It provides, and it takes. His people have always known this. What troubles him is the not knowing, the absence of explanation, the way his father simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. The traditional stories speak of people who are taken, but they also speak of signs, of warnings, of patterns that can be read by those who know how to look. His father left no signs. The land provided no warnings. Whatever happened was outside the patterns that generations of knowledge had prepared them to recognize. The Gwich'in community held a memorial ceremony for him. Though without a body to bury, the ceremony felt incomplete. The elders spoke of the old stories, the ones about people who walked into the wilderness and were taken by something that dwelt there. They did not claim to know what had taken Vincent Crowfeather. They only said that the land had its own purposes and that humans were not always meant to understand them. His clients returned to Texas with their caribou meat and their stories. They have not returned to Alaska. They told investigators that the trip had been going perfectly until Crow Feather walked over that hill and did not come back. They said they still wake sometimes from dreams in which they are calling his name into the darkness, hearing nothing in response but the wind over the tundra. The ridge where he was heading is still there, unchanged. Caribou still migrate through the drainage every fall. Other guides have taken clients into the same country, walking the same trails, glassing from the same vantage points. They know the story of Vincent Crow Feather. They carry satellite beacons and check in regularly. They do not walk alone if they can avoid it. The wilderness that took him is patient. It does not explain. It does not apologize. It simply holds what it has taken and waits for the next person to walk into its embrace. 200 miles to the south, in a very different landscape, another disappearance occurred that adds to the pattern of the Alaska Triangle. This case involved not a civilian, but a law enforcement officer, a man whose job was to bring order to the wilderness and to find people who had become lost in it. Sergeant William Tate was 41 years old, a veteran of the Alaska State Troopers with 17 years of service. He was assigned to a remote post in the Matanuska-Susitna Borough, the vast region north of Anchorage that includes some of the most rugged terrain in the state. His duties included everything from traffic enforcement on the few roads to search and rescue operations in the backcountry to criminal investigations in communities accessible only by aircraft. He was exactly the kind of officer that Alaska needs in its remote regions: resourceful, self-reliant, comfortable operating alone in conditions that would paralyze officers from more populated states. He could fly a bush plane, drive a snowmobile in whiteout conditions, survive for days in the wilderness if necessary. He had conducted dozens of search operations for lost hikers and hunters. He understood the terrain, respected its dangers, and knew how to navigate its challenges. On February 3, 2021, Sergeant Tate departed his post for what was logged as a routine patrol of the Talkeetna Mountains region. Heavy snowfall over the previous week had raised concerns about stranded travelers and about a remote cabin community that had not been heard from in several days. Tate planned to check on the community, verify that residents were safe, and return to his post by evening. He departed at approximately 8 in the morning, driving a state trooper snowmobile equipped with GPS tracking, a satellite phone, and emergency supplies sufficient for several days in the field. The weather was cold, but clear. The route to the cabin community was approximately 40 miles, terrain that Tate had traveled many times before. At 10:47 in the morning, Tate radioed his dispatcher to report that he had reached the halfway point and was proceeding as planned. The transmission was routine, showing no signs of concern or distress. At 11:22, the GPS tracking system showed that his snowmobile had stopped moving. The location was approximately 6 miles short of the cabin community, in a valley between two ridges. The dispatcher attempted to reach him by radio. No response. She tried the satellite phone. No answer. A search operation was initiated within 2 hours. The weather remained clear, and a helicopter was dispatched to the coordinates where the snowmobile had stopped. The helicopter found the snowmobile parked in the valley, engine off, keys in the ignition. The machine was undamaged. Fuel was adequate. All systems appeared functional. The emergency supplies were still strapped to the cargo rack. The satellite phone was in its mount on the handlebars, fully charged. Sergeant Tate was not with the snowmobile. The search team landed and examined the area. They found tracks leading away from the snowmobile, heading north up a gentle slope toward the ridge. The tracks were consistent with a man walking at a normal pace, not running, not stumbling. They continued for approximately 300 yards before reaching a section of wind-blown snow where they became difficult to follow. Beyond the wind-blown section, the searchers could not definitively identify continuing tracks. The terrain was mixed, with patches of deep snow, exposed rock, and areas scoured clean by wind. If Tate had continued in the same direction, he would have crested the ridge and descended into the next valley. If he had turned, he could have gone in any direction. The search expanded rapidly. Additional helicopters were deployed. Dog teams were flown to the area. Thermal imaging equipment scanned the terrain through the short winter daylight and into the darkness. More than 100 searchers participated over the following 2 weeks. They found no trace of Sergeant William Tate. The ridge he appeared to be walking toward was searched exhaustively. The valley beyond it was searched. The surrounding terrain for miles in every direction was searched. Searchers checked every cabin, every cache, every shelter within a 20-mile radius. The land gave up nothing. The snowmobile offered few clues. The GPS track showed a normal approach to the stopping point, with no unusual movements or detours. The last recorded speed before stopping was normal cruising speed. Whatever caused Tate to stop and dismount, it was not mechanical failure or accident. The satellite phone records showed no outgoing calls after his last radio transmission. If he had encountered trouble, he had not attempted to call for help. If he had seen something that drew him away from his vehicle, he had not reported it. His radio was still clipped to his belt when he walked away. The radio was found on the ground approximately 150 yards from the snowmobile, lying in the snow as if it had been dropped or discarded. It was functional. The battery was charged. There was no damage to explain why he would have removed it. The investigation examined multiple theories. The first theory was a wildlife encounter. The area had both brown bears and wolves, though February encounters with bears are rare, as most are still in hibernation. A wolf attack was possible, but would typically leave evidence. No blood was found on the radio or anywhere else. No drag marks, no struggle, no sign of violence. The second theory was a medical emergency. Tate was 41 and in good physical condition, but medical events can strike without warning. If he had suffered a heart attack or stroke, he might have walked away from his snowmobile in a confused state before collapsing. But the terrain was searched thoroughly. A body should have been found. The third theory was that he had seen something that drew him away from his vehicle. Perhaps a person in distress, or a situation that required investigation. A state trooper encountering someone who needed help would naturally go to assist, but this theory required explaining why he had not radioed the situation, why he had not taken his satellite phone, why he had apparently dropped his radio partway to wherever he was going. The fourth theory was foul play. Perhaps Tate had encountered someone in the backcountry who meant him harm. The remote location would make an ideal place to ambush a lone officer. But there was no evidence of any other person in the area. No tracks but his own. No vehicles. No indication of conflict. The fifth theory acknowledged what the investigation could not explain. A veteran state trooper stopped his snowmobile in remote terrain for unknown reasons. He walked away from his vehicle without his satellite phone. He dropped his radio partway up a slope. He continued toward a ridge and was never seen again. The Alaska State Troopers do not give up on their own. The search for Sergeant Tate continued intermittently through the spring, with teams returning to the area whenever weather permitted. When the snow melted, ground teams walked the terrain again, looking for anything that might have been hidden by winter conditions. The ground revealed nothing. His wife was notified of his disappearance on the evening of February 3rd, 2021. She has lived in uncertainty ever since. She told investigators that her husband was not a man who made mistakes in the field. He had survived situations that would have killed less experienced officers. He did not panic, did not act irrationally, did not abandon equipment without reason. She believes that something happened in that valley that does not fit any normal explanation. She does not claim to know what. She only knows that her husband was one of the most capable officers in the state, that he walked away from his snowmobile and his equipment in the middle of a routine patrol, and that no trace of him has ever been found. Their daughter was 12 when her father disappeared. She has grown up with the absence, with the photographs on the walls, with the annual memorials that mark another year without answers. She told a counselor that she sometimes imagines her father is still out there somewhere, walking through the snow, trying to find his way home. She knows this is not realistic. She cannot stop imagining it anyway. The trooper community rallied around the family in the months after the disappearance. Colleagues covered shifts, organized fundraisers, provided support in the way that law enforcement families support each other when one of their own is lost. But the support could not provide what the family needed most, which was information. What happened to William Tate? where he went, why he walked away from everything that could have kept him safe. His commanding officer gave a statement after the search was suspended. He said that Sergeant Tate was one of the best officers he had ever worked with, that his disappearance made no sense given everything known about his character and capabilities. He said the Alaska State Troopers would continue to investigate, would follow any lead that emerged, would not forget their colleague or abandon the search for answers. Years have passed. No leads have emerged. The investigation file remains open but inactive, waiting for information that may never arrive. The Alaska State Troopers added his name to the memorial for officers lost in the line of duty, though his status remains officially missing rather than confirmed deceased. The post where he served has continued operations with a replacement officer who now patrols the same territory, drives the same routes, checks on the same remote communities. The valley where Sergeant Tate disappeared is unremarkable. There is nothing visible that distinguishes it from thousands of similar valleys throughout the Alaska Triangle. No unusual features, no known hazards, no history of previous disappearances. It is simply a place where a trained, equipped, experienced law enforcement officer walked away from his vehicle and vanished. The snowmobile was eventually recovered and returned to service. The satellite phone and radio were logged as evidence, though there is nothing evidential about them beyond the fact that they were abandoned. The GPS tracker showed exactly where the machine stopped, exactly where Tate was when he decided to walk away. It does not show why. The remote cabin community that Tate had been heading to check on was eventually contacted by another trooper several days later. The residents were fine. They had simply lost satellite phone connectivity due to equipment failure and had not realized that anyone was concerned about them. They were horrified to learn that a trooper had disappeared while coming to check on their welfare. Several of them joined the search teams, combing terrain they had lived near for decades, finding nothing that explained what had happened. One of the community residents, an elderly woman who had lived in the area for more than 40 years, told investigators that the valley where Tate disappeared had always felt strange to her. She could not articulate why. Nothing had ever happened there that she knew of. There were no stories, no history, no reason for her feeling. It was simply a place she had always avoided, a patch of terrain that felt different from the surrounding landscape in ways she could not describe. The investigators noted her statement, but could not use it as evidence. Feelings are not data. Intuitions are not proof. The valley looked identical to thousands of other valleys in the Alaska Triangle. Whatever the woman sensed about it, if she sensed anything at all, did not manifest in any way that could be measured or documented. The patterns across these cases continue to accumulate. Vincent Crow Feather, a guide with lifetime knowledge of his territory, walking toward a ridge he had visited countless times, leaving his equipment behind piece by piece until he himself was gone. William Tate, a state trooper on routine patrol, stopping his snowmobile for no apparent reason, and walking into terrain that swallowed him without trace. Neither man was inexperienced. Neither was unprepared. Neither was operating in conditions beyond their capabilities. Both made decisions in their final moments that seem inexplicable in retrospect. Both left equipment behind that should have remained with them. Both walked in directions that led away from safety and toward disappearance. The Alaska Triangle does not discriminate. It takes hunters and scientists, guides and troopers, politicians and tourists. It takes people in summer and winter, in good weather and bad, in familiar terrain and unknown territory. The common thread is not the victims, but the outcome. People vanish. Searches find nothing. The land offers no explanations. Some researchers have attempted to map the disappearances, looking for geographic clusters or temporal patterns that might explain what is happening. They have found concentrations in certain areas, particularly in the mountain ranges north of Anchorage, and in the vast interior between Fairbanks and the Arctic coast. They have found seasonal patterns, with more disappearances during the summer months when more people are in the backcountry, but also a persistent rate of winter disappearances that suggests the phenomenon is not simply a function of exposure to the wilderness. What they have not found is an explanation. The maps show where people vanish, but not why. The statistics document the rate of disappearance, but not the cause. The case files accumulate details that describe what was found and when, but they cannot describe what happened to the people who are no longer there to tell their own stories. The families of the missing form an informal community, connected by shared grief and shared uncertainty. They meet at memorials and advocacy events. They share information about searches and investigations. They support each other through anniversaries and holidays that arrive each year with the same unanswered questions. The wife of Vincent Crow Feather has spoken with the wife of William Tate. They have compared notes on their husbands' disappearances, looking for commonalities that might explain what happened. They found the same pattern: capable men, routine circumstances, sudden departure from normal behavior, complete absence of evidence. They found no explanation. They have both said that the hardest part is not the grief. Grief is painful, but manageable. The hardest part is not knowing what happened, not knowing where their husbands are, not knowing whether they suffered, whether they struggled, whether they had any awareness of what was happening to them. The uncertainty creates a wound that cannot heal, because healing requires closure that the wilderness refuses to provide. The behavior of both men in their final documented moments deserves examination. Both were following routine paths, doing work they had done countless times before. Both stopped at points that had no obvious significance, no apparent hazard, no reason to pause. Both left equipment behind in ways that suggest deliberate action rather than accident or attack. Vincent Crow Feather set down his pack as if he intended to return for it. The pack was upright, positioned carefully, not dropped or thrown. His rifle was found separately, suggesting he carried it farther before setting it down as well. The progression suggests a man shedding weight, preparing for something that required him to be unencumbered. But what? The ridge ahead of him offered nothing that would require dropping equipment. He had carried the same load to that ridge many times before. William Tate stopped his snowmobile in a location with no obvious features. The GPS track shows a normal approach, normal speed, then a stop. He dismounted, walked away, dropped his radio partway up a slope. Again, a progression. Again, a shedding of equipment. Again, a movement toward something that apparently drew him forward while leaving behind the tools that could have saved him or summoned help. Researchers who study missing person cases have documented a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia victims remove their clothing in the final stages before death. The cold triggers a sensation of burning heat, and victims strip away the very protection they need. But neither Crowfeather nor Tate showed signs of hypothermia exposure. The conditions on both days were cold, but not extreme. Both men were experienced in managing the temperatures they faced. Another documented phenomenon is called terminal burrowing, where hypothermia victims seek small, enclosed spaces to hide in, a behavior linked to primitive brain responses as higher functions fail. But neither man burrowed or hid. Both walked forward into open terrain, toward destinations unknown. The behavior of both men more closely resembles cases of disorientation or attraction, situations where victims move toward something they perceive as important or necessary. But what could have attracted a veteran hunting guide and a veteran state trooper so powerfully that they abandoned their equipment and walked toward it without calling for assistance, without leaving any indication of what they had seen? The Alaska Triangle has accumulated many such cases. People who stop without apparent cause, people who leave equipment behind, people who walk in directions that lead away from safety, people who vanish without triggering emergency beacons or calling for help. The pattern is consistent even when the individuals are not. The wilderness extracts the same behavior from different people, in different circumstances, at different times. Some investigators have suggested that the Alaska Triangle contains environmental factors that affect human cognition, magnetic anomalies that interfere with the brain's navigational systems, infrasound generated by wind over mountain ridges, frequencies below human hearing that can cause feelings of unease, disorientation, or panic, gases released by geological activity, odorless compounds that affect mental state without being detected. None of these theories has been proven. None has been definitively disproven either. The Alaska Triangle remains a place where things happen that the normal vocabulary of accident and exposure and wildlife attack does not fully explain. What is certain is that the disappearances continue. Every year, people enter the Alaska Triangle and do not return. Some are found. Many are not. The statistics grow longer, and the families grow more numerous, and the questions accumulate faster than the answers. The lake was surrounded by witnesses. More than 40 people were present that afternoon, scattered along the shoreline, enjoying one of the last warm days of the Alaska summer. They were fishing, picnicking, photographing the scenery. Several of them had binoculars. At least 3 had cameras with telephoto lenses. The lake was small enough that a person on one shore could see clearly to the other side. Visibility was excellent. The water was calm, and yet, in full view of more than 40 people, a kayaker paddled to the center of the lake and disappeared. This case challenges every assumption about how wilderness disappearances occur. There was no remote terrain, no vast search area, no question of where the victim was last seen. There were dozens of witnesses, clear conditions, and a body of water small enough to be searched in its entirety. The disappearance should have been impossible. It happened anyway. The kayaker was named Margaret Chen. She was 31 years old, a software engineer from Anchorage who had taken up kayaking 3 years earlier as a way to explore the wilderness around her adopted home. She was not an expert paddler, but she was competent. She had completed a water safety course, owned proper equipment, and understood the basics of cold water survival. The lake where she disappeared, a small body of water in the Matanuska Valley, about 60 miles northeast of Anchorage, was well within her skill level. On August 23, 2018, Margaret drove to the lake with her kayak, planning an afternoon of paddling and photography. The weather was warm and clear, temperatures in the low 60s, with light wind and excellent visibility. The lake was a popular recreation spot, and by early afternoon, several dozen people had gathered along the shores for various activities. Multiple witnesses saw Margaret arrive, unload her kayak, and launch from a small beach on the east side of the lake. She was wearing a red life jacket, clearly visible against the blue water. She paddled west toward the center of the lake, moving at a leisurely pace, occasionally stopping to take photographs with a camera she wore on a strap around her neck. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Margaret was in the center of the lake, roughly equidistant from all shores. Several witnesses were watching her at that moment, including a man with binoculars who was birdwatching from the western shore. The birdwatcher would later tell investigators that he had noticed the red kayak and was idly watching the paddler when something unusual happened. According to his statement, Margaret stopped paddling and appeared to look down into the water. She remained motionless for several seconds, as if studying something below the surface. Then she leaned to one side, and the kayak capsized. The birdwatcher expected to see her surface immediately. A capsized kayaker in a life jacket should bob up within seconds, the flotation device doing exactly what it was designed to do. He watched the overturned kayak, waiting for the red of her life jacket to appear beside it. It did not appear. He continued watching for perhaps 30 seconds, growing increasingly concerned. The kayak remained overturned. No swimmer surfaced. The water around the kayak was undisturbed, showing no sign of someone struggling or swimming beneath the surface. The birdwatcher began shouting to others on the shore, pointing toward the capsized kayak. Within a minute, several people were watching. Within 2 minutes, someone had called 911. Within 5 minutes, 2 men in a fishing boat were motoring toward the overturned kayak to attempt a rescue. When they reached the kayak, approximately 7 minutes after the capsizing, Margaret Chen was not there. She was not floating beside the kayak. She was not clinging to it. She was not visible anywhere on the surface of the lake. The water was clear enough that the men in the fishing boat could see the bottom in most areas. They saw nothing. The rescue operation that followed was swift and thorough. Divers arrived within 2 hours and searched the lake bottom in expanding circles from where the kayak had been found. The lake was small, approximately 200 acres, with a maximum depth of about 60 feet. The divers covered the entire bottom over the following 2 days. They did not find Margaret Chen. Her kayak was recovered, undamaged. Her paddle was found floating nearby. Her camera was never found, presumably having sunk when she capsized. Her life jacket was not recovered, which investigators found puzzling. A life jacket should float, and hers had been clearly visible on her body minutes before the capsizing. The investigation examined every possible explanation for her disappearance. The first theory was drowning with body concealment. Perhaps Margaret had drowned immediately upon capsizing, and her body had become trapped in underwater vegetation, debris, or some feature of the lake bottom. But the divers searched exhaustively and found no body. The lake bottom was relatively uniform, with few features that could trap a human form, and the life jacket should have brought her to the surface regardless of what happened beneath the water. The second theory was that she had removed her life jacket while underwater and swum away. Perhaps she had staged her own disappearance, capsizing deliberately and swimming to shore while witnesses were focused on the kayak. But this theory had significant problems. The water temperature was approximately 50 degrees, cold enough to cause incapacitation within minutes for an unprotected swimmer. The distance to shore from the center of the lake was several hundred yards, and no one among the 40-plus witnesses reported seeing a swimmer or someone emerging from the water anywhere along the shoreline. The third theory was cardiac arrest or some other sudden medical event. Perhaps Margaret had suffered a heart attack or stroke, causing her to capsize and sink immediately. But again, the life jacket should have kept her body at the surface, and the witness who watched her capsize described deliberate movement, her leaning to one side, rather than the collapse that would accompany a sudden medical emergency. The fourth theory was animal attack. The lake was not known to contain any predators large enough to pull a human underwater, but the possibility was considered. Investigators consulted with wildlife experts who confirmed that no species in Alaskan freshwater lakes would be capable of such an attack. There were no alligators, no large predatory fish, nothing that could drag a kayaker beneath the surface and prevent her from resurfacing. The fifth theory acknowledged what could not be explained. A woman capsized her kayak in full view of dozens of witnesses in clear conditions, in a small lake, wearing a life jacket. She never resurfaced. Her body was never found. Her life jacket was never found. The circumstances defy any conventional explanation. The witness who had been watching through binoculars provided additional details that investigators found difficult to interpret. He said that in the moment before the kayak capsized, Margaret appeared to be reaching toward the water, as if trying to touch something below the surface. He said her posture suggested fascination rather than fear. She was not recoiling from something. She was leaning toward it. He also said that when the kayak overturned, it did not appear to be a violent motion. It looked almost deliberate, as if she had chosen to enter the water rather than being pulled or knocked in. The capsizing was smooth, controlled, the way a kayaker might exit their craft intentionally. But why would a kayaker in the middle of a lake deliberately capsize and then refuse to surface? What could possibly have been in the water that would cause her to lean toward it, enter it, and never come back up? The family of Margaret Chen was notified of her disappearance that evening. Her parents flew from California to Alaska within days, staying for the duration of the search and for weeks afterward, unable to accept that their daughter had simply vanished from a lake surrounded by witnesses in broad daylight. Her mother gave an interview several months later. She said the hardest part was how impossible it seemed. Her daughter had not gone into remote wilderness. She had not been alone. She had been surrounded by people, in clear view, in a tiny lake that should have revealed any secret it held. And yet the lake had taken her, had swallowed her completely, had given back nothing but an empty kayak and an unanswerable question. The lake has been searched multiple times since the initial investigation. Private divers hired by the family have examined the bottom. Sonar equipment has scanned every square foot of the underwater terrain. Seasonal variations in water level have exposed new sections of shoreline. Nothing has been found. The investigation consulted with experts in underwater search and recovery, trying to understand how a body could vanish so completely from such a small, contained body of water. The experts were puzzled. A lake that size, with that depth profile, should not be able to hide a human body indefinitely. Decomposition gases would eventually bring a body to the surface. Even if the body became trapped somehow, the life jacket should have separated and floated up on its own. One expert suggested that there might be an underground outflow, a subterranean channel through which water drained from the lake into some other system. If Margaret had been pulled into such a channel, she might have been carried into underground passages that would never be found. But geological surveys of the area found no evidence of such features. The lake had no outlets, surface or subterranean. It was a closed basin, fed by snowmelt and rain, with no way for its contents to exit except through evaporation. The birdwatcher who had been the closest observer at the moment of capsizing was interviewed multiple times. Each time, he provided the same account. Margaret had been paddling normally. She stopped and looked down. She leaned toward the water as if reaching for something. The kayak overturned smoothly. She did not surface. When pressed about what she might have been looking at, what could have been in the water that would draw her attention, the birdwatcher said he had no idea. The lake was known to contain only small fish and aquatic invertebrates. There were no unusual features visible from the surface. There was nothing that should have attracted the attention of a kayaker in the center of the lake. But he was certain about what he saw. She was reaching for something. She was leaning toward something. And then she was gone. The case remains open. The lake remains popular with visitors, most of whom do not know what happened there in August of 2018. The water is calm and clear, the shores accessible, the depth modest. It looks like any other small Alaska lake, unremarkable and benign. Somewhere in that water, or somewhere else entirely, Margaret Chen has been gone for more than 7 years. She capsized in full view of witnesses. She never resurfaced. The explanation for what happened to her doesn't exist in any vocabulary that investigators have been able to apply. The Alaska Triangle does not limit itself to vast wilderness areas. It does not require remote terrain or impossible search conditions. Sometimes it operates in plain sight, taking people from places where they should have been safe, leaving witnesses who saw everything and understand nothing. 300 miles to the northwest, in airspace that has claimed more than its share of victims, another disappearance occurred that adds to the documented pattern of the Alaska Triangle. This case involves a commercial pilot, a man whose job was to fly passengers safely through some of the most challenging airspace in North America. Captain Raymond Whitehorse was 48 years old, a pilot for a regional airline that served communities throughout western Alaska. He had more than 12,000 hours of flight time, most of it in Alaska, most of it in small aircraft operating in conditions that would ground pilots in any other state. He held every rating available for the aircraft he flew. He had never been involved in an accident or serious incident. His safety record was impeccable. On November 15, 2020, Captain Whitehorse departed Nome, bound for Kotzebue, a community of approximately 3,000 people on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. The flight was routine, a distance of approximately 170 miles that he had flown hundreds of times. He was carrying 6 passengers, all residents of Kotzebue, returning from business or medical appointments in Nome. The aircraft was a de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter, a workhorse of Alaska aviation, designed specifically for short takeoff and landing operations in remote areas. The plane had been recently inspected and certified airworthy. Weather conditions along the route were acceptable, with high clouds, good visibility, and moderate winds. Captain Whitehorse took off from Nome at approximately 11:30 in the morning. He made routine radio contacts with Nome Radio and Kotzebue approach control as he flew northwest along the coast. His final transmission came at approximately 12:05, when he reported to Kotzebue that he was 25 miles out and beginning his approach. The transmission ended mid-sentence. According to the controller who was handling the flight, Captain Whitehorse was speaking normally, reporting his position and intentions, when his voice simply stopped. There was no cry of alarm, No indication of emergency. No change in tone that suggested anything was wrong. One moment he was talking. The next moment, he was not. The controller attempted to re-establish contact. No response. He tried multiple frequencies. Nothing. He contacted Nome to verify that the aircraft had not turned back. It had not. The Twin Otter had stopped transmitting and stopped responding somewhere in the 25 miles between its last reported position and Kotzebue. The search began immediately. Aircraft from Kotzebue and Nome took off within the hour to fly the route and look for signs of the missing plane. The Coast Guard dispatched helicopters. Search and rescue teams staged at both ends of the route. The conditions that afternoon were reasonable for aerial search. Visibility was good. The terrain below was tundra and coastal plain, relatively flat and open. An aircraft down in that environment should have been visible from the air, particularly a white Twin Otter against the brown and white landscape of early winter. The searchers found nothing. The search expanded over the following days, eventually covering thousands of square miles of coastal Alaska. Aircraft flew grid patterns over every possible location where the Twin Otter might have gone down. Ground teams searched accessible areas of the coastline. The Coast Guard examined stretches of ocean where the plane might have ditched. No wreckage was found. No debris. No oil slick. No emergency beacon signal, despite the aircraft carrying 2 emergency locator transmitters that should have activated automatically upon impact. The Twin Otter and its 7 occupants had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The investigation that followed was extensive. The National Transportation Safety Board examined every aspect of the flight, the aircraft, the pilot, and the conditions. Every avenue led to a dead end. The aircraft had no known mechanical issues. The weather was not severe enough to cause an in-flight breakup. The pilot was experienced and well-rested. The route was familiar and well-documented. There was no indication of pilot incapacitation, no distress in the voice recordings, no deviation from the expected flight path prior to the loss of contact. The NTSB concluded that the probable cause of the accident could not be determined. The aircraft had vanished without providing any data that would allow investigators to understand what had happened. The case was closed as unsolved. Another entry in the long list of Alaska aviation mysteries. The Twin Otter that Captain Whitehorse was flying that day had been in service for more than 30 years, a veteran of thousands of flights across western Alaska. It had operated in conditions far worse than those present on November 15th. It had carried thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. There was nothing in its history that would have predicted catastrophic failure. The passengers aboard that flight were ordinary people, residents of Kotzebue going about their daily lives, a teacher returning from a conference in Anchorage, a grandmother who had been visiting family in Nome, a young man heading home after medical treatment, a couple who had been shopping for winter supplies. Their names were added to the rolls of those who have vanished in the Alaska Triangle, joining thousands of others whose final moments remain unknown. The search for the aircraft continued intermittently for months after the initial operation was suspended. Satellite imagery was analyzed. Coastline surveys were conducted after breakup in the spring. Reports of debris sightings were investigated. None led to the missing aircraft. Some researchers have suggested that the plane might have gone down in the Chukchi Sea, that a sudden emergency drove Captain Whitehorse away from the coastline and over the water, where the aircraft sank without leaving surface evidence. But this theory conflicts with the final transmission, which placed the aircraft on a normal approach to Kotzebue, over land, with no indication of any deviation from the planned route. Others have suggested that the aircraft might have experienced sudden catastrophic structural failure, breaking apart in flight and scattering debris over a wide area that searchers simply did not cover. But aircraft do not typically break apart without warning in conditions like those present that day, and the debris field from such a failure should have been detectable, particularly the emergency locator transmitters that should have survived and activated. The families of the 7 people aboard that aircraft have never received answers. The pilot's wife was left to raise 2 teenage children without knowing what happened to their father. The passengers' families were left with the same unanswerable questions that torment everyone who loses loved ones in the Alaska Triangle. One detail from the investigation has drawn particular attention from researchers who study the Alaska Triangle. The controller who was handling the flight described the moment of lost contact in his official statement. He said that Captain Whitehorse was speaking in a completely normal voice, providing routine position information when the transmission simply stopped, not faded, not broke up, not showed any sign of distress or interference. The controller said it was as if someone had switched off the radio in the middle of a word. The voice was there, then it was not. He had handled thousands of flights over his career. He had never experienced anything like it. The complete absence of any transition, any warning, any indication that something was about to go wrong, was unlike any communication failure he had ever encountered. Researchers have noted that this pattern appears in other Alaska Triangle cases. Communications that end abruptly, without the deterioration or distortion that normally accompanies radio problems or aircraft emergencies. People who are speaking normally one moment and gone the next. The transition from presence to absence happening so quickly that it seems to bypass the normal process of things going wrong. The sky over western Alaska continues to carry aircraft between isolated communities, just as it did before Captain Whitehorse and his passengers vanished. Other pilots fly the same routes, make the same radio calls, navigate the same airspace. They know the story of the missing Twin Otter. They know it is not the only aircraft to vanish in that region without explanation. They fly anyway, because the communities depend on them, because the work needs to be done, because the alternative is to surrender the sky to whatever took the missing aircraft, and so many other flights before and since. The Twin Otter that vanished carried passengers who had no choice but to fly. In western Alaska, there are no roads connecting most communities. The only way in or out is by aircraft. The people who live there accept this reality and the risks that come with it. They board small planes in conditions that would cancel flights elsewhere. They trust their pilots to navigate airspace that has claimed more than its share of victims. That trust is usually rewarded. The vast majority of Alaska flights arrive safely at their destinations. The pilots who work these routes are among the most skilled in the world, trained by conditions that would terrify pilots from more forgiving regions. The aircraft they fly are maintained to rigorous standards, inspected regularly, equipped with redundant safety systems. But sometimes the flights do not arrive. Sometimes the pilots stop responding mid-sentence. Sometimes the aircraft simply vanish, leaving no debris, no signal, no explanation. The passengers and crew join the statistics, become case numbers in files that will never be closed, add their names to the long list of those who entered the Alaska Triangle and did not emerge. The families of Captain Raymond Whitehorse and his 6 passengers have established a memorial fund that provides scholarships to students in Kotzebue who want to pursue careers in aviation. They believe that the best way to honor those who vanished is to support the next generation of pilots who will fly the same routes, carry the same communities, accept the same risks. The fund has awarded more than 30 scholarships since it was established. The scholarship recipients know the story of the missing flight. They study it as part of their training, trying to understand what went wrong, looking for lessons that might keep them safe. They find no lessons. The flight was routine until it was not. The pilot was experienced until experience no longer mattered. The aircraft was airworthy until it ceased to exist. They graduate anyway. They take jobs with regional carriers. They fly the routes that Captain Whitehorse flew, over the same terrain, through the same airspace. They make the same radio calls, report the same positions, follow the same procedures. They trust that they will be different, that whatever happened will not happen to them. Most of them are right. Most of them have long careers and retire safely. But some of them join the statistics, become case numbers, add their names to the list. The Alaska Triangle continues to operate according to patterns that researchers have documented but cannot explain. People vanish from locations where they should be found. Aircraft disappear from airspace where they should be tracked. Searches cover terrain exhaustively, and find nothing. The wilderness keeps taking, and it rarely gives back what it has taken. The cases presented in this examination represent only a fraction of the documented disappearances within the Alaska Triangle. There are hundreds more, stretching back decades, each with its own circumstances and its own unanswered questions. A complete catalog would fill volumes. A complete understanding remains beyond our reach. What the cases share is a pattern of impossibility. Experienced people vanishing while doing things they had done safely many times before. Equipment abandoned without explanation. Searches finding nothing despite covering probable locations thoroughly. Evidence that seems to contradict itself, that suggests behavior that makes no sense, that points toward explanations that do not exist. The Alaska Triangle has been called many things by those who study it. A statistical anomaly, a geographic danger zone, a region where environmental factors combine to create unusual risks, a place where something operates that we do not understand. The truth is probably simpler and more disturbing. The Alaska Triangle is a place where the wilderness does what wilderness does everywhere, taking people who enter it, keeping them or releasing them according to principles we cannot predict. The difference is scale. The Alaska Triangle is vast, remote, and harsh in ways that most wilderness is not. It offers more opportunities for disappearance and fewer opportunities for rescue. It conceals what it takes more effectively because there is simply more of it, more space to hide the lost, more terrain to defeat those who come looking. But scale does not fully explain cases like Margaret Chen, who vanished from a small lake surrounded by witnesses. Scale does not explain Captain Whitehorse, whose aircraft disappeared from tracked airspace 25 miles from his destination. Scale does not explain the patterns of behavior that appear across so many cases, the abandoned equipment, the unexplained direction changes, the progression from presence to absence that happens so smoothly and completely. Something is happening in the Alaska Triangle that the normal vocabulary of accident and exposure and natural hazard doesn't fully capture. The statistics are too high. The patterns are too consistent. The cases are too strange. This examination has presented 6 cases from the Alaska Triangle. A congressional leader whose aircraft vanished despite the largest search in American history. A glaciologist whose team walked out of their station and disappeared on the ice. A hunting guide who dropped his equipment piece by piece until he himself was gone. A state trooper who walked away from his snowmobile and never looked back. A kayaker who capsized in full view of witnesses and never resurfaced. A commercial pilot whose voice stopped mid-sentence and was never heard again. 6 cases, 6 patterns of impossibility, 6 sets of families living with questions that have no answers. The families of the Alaska Triangle missing have formed a community of shared grief and shared advocacy. They push for better search technology, better emergency equipment, better understanding of what happens when people vanish in the wilderness. They keep the cases alive in public memory, refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten, insisting that the questions continue to be asked, even when the answers refuse to come. They know that their efforts may never produce the closure they seek. The Alaska Triangle has been keeping secrets for as long as humans have traveled through it. Indigenous peoples have stories stretching back thousands of years about people who walked into the wilderness and were never seen again. The pattern is ancient. The mystery is enduring. But the families persist. They search when resources allow. They advocate when opportunities arise. They remember when memory is all they have. They refuse to accept that their loved ones simply ceased to exist, that the wilderness can take people so completely that nothing remains. Not a body, not an explanation, not even a theory that adequately accounts for what happened. If you have watched this examination to its end, you understand something about the Alaska Triangle that most people do not. You understand that the disappearances are not random accidents in dangerous terrain. You understand that the patterns repeat, that the circumstances share elements that connect cases across decades and distances. You understand that something is happening in that vast stretch of wilderness that we do not fully comprehend. What you do with that understanding is up to you. You can dismiss the cases as statistical noise, as the inevitable result of people entering dangerous territory, and sometimes not surviving. You can accept the official explanations where they exist, and acknowledge uncertainty where they do not. You can move on with your life, treating the Alaska Triangle as a curiosity rather than a question that demands answers. Or you can keep watching. You can follow the research as it develops. You can pay attention when new cases emerge, as they inevitably will. You can add your voice to those calling for better understanding, better resources, better answers. The Alaska Triangle is not going to stop taking people. The wilderness is patient and indifferent. It operates on timescales that dwarf human lives and human memories. It will continue to do what it has always done, absorbing those who enter it, keeping what it takes, releasing what it chooses on schedules we cannot predict. The least we can do is pay attention. The least we can do is remember. More than 16,000 people have vanished in Alaska since 1988. Many of them disappeared within the boundaries of the Alaska Triangle. Most of them have never been found. Their families still wait. Their questions still hang in the air. If you believe that these cases deserve continued attention, if you believe that the patterns documented here warrant further investigation, consider subscribing to follow future examinations. The Alaska Triangle is not finished revealing its secrets. The research is not finished uncovering its patterns. And the wilderness is not finished taking people into its depths. This has been an examination of the Alaska Triangle, the region that claims more people than the Bermuda Triangle, the wilderness that keeps what it takes, the mystery that remains unsolved despite decades of searching and studying and asking questions that the landscape refuses to answer. The 6 cases presented here span different terrains, different circumstances, different decades. An aircraft carrying political leaders that vanished without leaving a single rivet. A research team that walked out of their station and disappeared on a glacier. A hunting guide whose ancestral knowledge could not save him from whatever drew him into the tundra. A state trooper who stopped his snowmobile and walked away from everything that could have protected him. A kayaker who capsized in full view of dozens of witnesses and never surfaced. A commercial pilot whose voice stopped mid-sentence as his aircraft passed from the known into the unknown. What connects these cases is not just geography. It is not just the harsh conditions of the Alaska wilderness. It is a pattern of behavior that appears again and again, a sequence of actions that leads from presence to absence, with a consistency that suggests something more than random accident. People stop, they turn, they leave behind equipment that could save them. They move toward something that observers cannot see and investigators cannot identify. They pass from being present in the world to being absent from it, and the transition happens so smoothly that it leaves almost no trace. The Alaska Triangle has been studied by researchers, documented by investigators, explored by searchers. It has yielded some of its secrets over the years, releasing remains that had been hidden for decades, providing occasional answers to questions that had gone unanswered. But for every secret it reveals, it keeps 100 more. The pattern will continue. People will enter the Alaska Triangle, as they have always entered it, drawn by the beauty of the landscape, the necessity of travel, the requirements of work and life in America's last frontier. Most of them will emerge safely. Some of them will not. For those who do not, for the families who wait and wonder, for the investigators who compile files full of evidence that explains nothing, the Alaska Triangle remains what it has always been, a place where the wilderness operates by rules that humans do not fully understand, where the answers to simple questions become impossibly complex, where people disappear and the landscape offers nothing but silence in response. The cases are real, the patterns are documented, the questions are open, and somewhere in the vast silence of the Alaska wilderness, the answers wait. They may emerge someday, carried out of the mountains or up from the glaciers or across the tundra by forces we do not yet understand. Or they may remain hidden forever, secrets kept by a landscape that does not answer to human curiosity or human grief. The Alaska Triangle endures. The disappearances continue. The mystery deepens with every case that cannot be solved. This is the nature of wilderness at its most extreme. This is what happens when people enter places that do not operate by human rules. This is the Alaska Triangle, and it is still waiting.